is coming to you from the beautiful multiverse and the beautiful metaverse in beautiful Danville, Illinois. And all of these things at once. And this is Midday with Rev Don. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. We will have a lovely conversation today, as we do every day. And if you wish to join that conversation, all you need to do is type your comments or questions into whatever platform you happen to be watching this on, and they will appear in my chat room and we can interact. And I love spending this time with you each day. I hope that you're enjoying it as well. And this has been an interesting week for these discussions, because more often than not, oh, and hello to Melanie in the chat room. Good to see you. More often than not, we've been talking about fairly deep subjects this week, and that's been quite refreshing. I don't know that we want to do that quite every day, but maybe we do, and that's something that that I'd like to know from you. What do you enjoy when we deal with these deeper subjects? For example, yesterday we were talking about, among other things, the nature of involution and evolution, and how these are touched on by many different things and how they touch on many different things. What we're going to talk about today, I don't really know yet. Hello to Calvin in the chat room. Good to see you, Calvin. I figure I will start by pointing out that tomorrow is my first Patreon seminar on the subject of the nature and practice of magic, and I'm looking forward to that. And it is available to people who are part of my Patreon at the seminar tier, or people who choose to simply buy a ticket, which you can find at CorellianPublishing.com. Last night, I spent some time making up crystal web booklets. You may have seen these at CorellianPublishing.com. They are a booklet on how to establish a crystal web access point, and they come with 2 crystals, one to bury and one to carry. And I put up a photo today on my Facebook page showing a few of the ones that were made up for sale, and this morning we sent out a bunch of them. And so people should be receiving these quickly. And this is also something that has been taking my attention lately. To do this, I got a new paper cutter, and it made it much easier than cutting by hand. If you're not familiar with this booklet, we actually have offered it for many years. It's been termed a mini booklet because they're not very big. I don't actually have one here with me. Hello to Janet in the chat room. And Janet says, I ordered mine. And good afternoon, Lord Don. Good afternoon, Janet. And yours, in fact, is in the mail as of today. They were waiting on the paper cutter so that we could have a good professional job. And also a new stapler to assist with putting them together as well. And they should be to you very quickly. Hello, Mary in the chat room. But these mini booklets, they were a part of a series that we did many years ago. Hello to Brenda in the chat room. Good to see you, Brenda. They include the crystal web access ritual. They include what is Corellianism. They include the Corellian Creed. They include Corellian soul retrieval. And all of these will probably soon become available again. And welcome, Jason. Welcome, Renee. Welcome, Bradley. Good to see all of you. Happy Friday, everyone. And the thing that made them interesting is they were made to be able to be carried in the pocket. Hello to Lilith. Thank you for joining us, Lilith. It's good to see you. And they can be printed out in many cases on a single piece of paper, double-sided, in some cases 2, and assembled quite easily. So they can be very easily shared with others if you wish to do so. This is one of the things I've been working on. As you know, we recently brought out the 5 Mystic Secrets multilingual edition. Many of them have recently gone out in the mail. I had the last of the jewelry sales go out in the mail from before and or during the move. There were people who came to me after I had stopped selling the jewelry and asked if certain pieces were still available. Those are the ones that have just gone out. And Lilith says, love the necklace. Thank you. This necklace originally belonged to Lady Crystal. She gave it to me. I think it makes a nice piece since I'm doing necklaces rather than ties at present. Originally, it was considerably longer. So when Lady Crystal wore it, it would have been 3 to 4 inches lower. But I like to keep it up here because of the nature of the clothing that I'm wearing. If I were wearing a turtleneck or something like that, I might wear it more at its original length. I have been quite enjoying getting back into necklaces and other pieces of jewelry. The change in wardrobe is for me a bit of a reversion to an earlier way of dressing, and that's one of the reasons I have so much of this jewelry, because it's not an entirely new way for me to dress. I just haven't done it for many years. Back in the 70s in particular, and still into the 80s, I often dressed basically as I'm dressed today. I did wear a jacket, but I kept ties for formal occasions, and otherwise I was quite likely to wear necklaces or other pieces of jewelry. And I like jewelry in the same way that I like ties, in the same way that I like, I guess we'd say, fashion in general. It's a creative expression. And with jewelry, it's a double creative expression. One, in choosing it and matching it, but also on occasion in making it. Jewelry has the virtue, unlike most clothes that we wear today, of being something that someone quite intentionally designed and created, and in many cases made by hand, depending on what it is. Certainly made a prototype by hand. And so it's someone's very personal expression. Some clothing is that way too, but a lot of clothing is just, another piece of the same thing in a different color. And putting it together in different ways, it is an act of creativity. But in and of itself, many of them are simply variations on a theme, but jewelry tends to be much more original. And Bradley says, I participated in a round table at my work today, and to help me be successful with it, I actually wore your round table necklace. Oh, that's wonderful, Bradley. I hope you found it helpful, and it has that quality. And for those who are not familiar with what Bradley is referring to, in the jewelry sale, one of the pieces that I sold was a necklace that we interpreted it as being in the shape of Arthur's round table, and as having an energetic connection to that idea. Bradley says it went very well. I'm glad to hear that. And it had been given to me many years ago, but was one of many pieces that I let go of because of various reasons. And I've kept certainly quite a few pieces, but I've been fairly selective in what I kept because, I kind of looked at this as a reset to my life. And we've talked about how, for example, in Chinese reckoning, the 60th year is a full astrological reset because the great cycle of Chinese astrology has completely passed in 60 years. The relationship between the heavenly stems and the earthly branches. And if you're not familiar with that term, you can find it in my second degree book where I talk about Asian astrology and the components that make it up, which are far more than what you see on the ubiquitous Asian astrology placemats at certain restaurants. It actually is a much richer and more complex system than that. But the placemat astrology is a good introduction to it. Very much like sun sign astrology in terms of Ptolemaic astrology, Western astrology. Sun sign astrology can be very, very useful if you choose for it to be, but it's only a tiny bit of what's going on astrologically. And the more you know, about your individual chart, the more you know about what's happening cosmically at any given time, the more information there is to be had. Having said that, I do tend to follow the daily horoscope and have found them to be quite accurate. But that's partly because I choose for them to be accurate. You know, as a child, one of the things I was taught is that the things you choose to believe take on a role in your life. And at a certain point, I looked at fortune cookies and said, you know, do I believe these work? And of course, my answer was, well, I guess if I want them to work. And so then the question was, do I want them to work? And I said, yes, I do. And for the most part, when I get fortune cookies, they are relevant and they do give me something which is relevant to what I'm doing. There are exceptions, and you know, some of the fortune cookies out there aren't even meant to be divinatory. But sometimes even those can fill that role because I've chosen that as one of the languages that spirit can use to speak to me. And this is what divination is from start to finish. And Jason, hello Jason, says that you can get second degree at CorellianPublishing.com. And this is true. Hello Mary, good to see you. But I was saying, astrology, numerology, tarot, even fortune cookies, all of these things work in part because we choose for them to work and let spirit know that we can be spoken to that way. A system of divination is basically an organized system of omens. Usually when we use the term omen, we're referring to something that comes singularly and randomly. But also, depending on the circumstances, at a time that you're looking for it or at a time that you're not. The same is true for divination, except with divination, you are in fact always looking because you've asked the question, and the omens come according to a certain system. But we have a lot to do with whether spirit will use that system to speak to us or not. This is one reason why, for example, with tarot cards, for many people, the artwork is very important. Either they can resonate to it or they can't. And if they can't, it's really not necessarily going to work well for them. And this too is dependent on the person and their relationship to spirit, their relationship to their higher self, how they want for this to work. But for a lot of people, there has to be that, that emotional tie into the artwork to really be able to use them well. Which is why it's good that there are so many different tarot decks, in my opinion, and also the many different oracle decks. And of course, the difference between a tarot deck and an oracle deck is that tarot does speak to a particular system, even though it has a wide range of variations. Hello to Matthew in the chat room. But it is still a certain continuum, which is based on a system developed, to all appearances, in the late medieval and Renaissance period in Europe, particularly Italy. Whereas playing cards, for example, which are also used for divination, developed in the Middle and Near East and then came to Europe. But tarot, as far as anyone can show, developed during this late medieval, early Renaissance period. Oracle cards, on the other hand, are systems of divinatory cards that don't use any part of that system that is tarot. And the system that is tarot involves both minor and major arcana. And usually, well, always at least some of the same specific major arcana cards, but they do vary widely. And this is historically as well as in the contemporary world. One of the things people forget about things like tarot cards is that down till a certain point, they were often created by hand for particular clients, particular patrons. And during that era, they could be highly variable according to what the patron wanted in them. The early tarot decks, the major arcana, were selected by the person who was going to use them, and don't necessarily correspond all that closely to later major arcanas, but there are always certain similarities. Later, when printing came about, they became more standard, but even then, there could be wide variations. And one of the more interesting variations occurred during the French Revolution, when tarot cards were printed that specifically excluded court cards because they were aristocracy and they couldn't have those. And they found an interesting way around that. And Calvin in the chat room says, I agree. That's why I work with the Handel tarot cards, which are very graphic and detailed. And yes, there is a tarot card for every taste. There are a number of them which are very personal interpretations. There are also some based on the work of famous artists. There's a Bosch tarot, which I think is very interesting, which uses particular pieces of the work of Hieronymus Bosch to illustrate the cards. And if you're familiar with the work of that artist, you'll know how surrealistic that deck can be. Salvador Dali did a tarot deck. There's literally something for every taste. Geiger did a tarot deck for those who are looking for a, quote, dark deck. So there's all kinds of things. And of course, the majority of tarot decks are variations on the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which was created in the early 20th century. And a lot of people, because of this, think, oh, hello, Lori, good to see you in the chat room. And she says, Lori says, I love the neck piece, thank you. Because of this, a lot of people think the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is very traditional. In fact, it's nothing of the sort. It is a radical departure from a traditional tarot. That's what made it so popular in the first place. The innovations that they made in that deck has spread through most decks subsequently. And the biggest innovation they made, they changed the numerology of the major arcana a little bit, but their biggest innovation was illustrating the pip cards. That is, the number cards in the minor arcana. And they illustrated them in such a way that each suit tells a story, which can be used by the reader to help to remember the meanings of the cards. They can be used in a mnemonistic way. And I think that's the word I'm looking for. But this was utterly unheard of before that deck, and very common now. So when you see the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, don't think you're looking at a traditional tarot. You're looking at a revolutionary tarot. The same was also true for the Tarot of Thoth, which followed a generation later from Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris, which approached tarot in still a different way, but was in its own way quite revolutionary. And then it would be many years before tarot really expanded in all directions. I had the great pleasure to be involved in the World Tarot Congresses back in the 1990s in Chicago. And if I recall, at the very first one, Eden Gray was a guest. And for those of you familiar with tarot, you'll know that Eden Gray was a very, very famous author on the subject of tarot in the 1960s, who was intimately involved in the Tarot Renaissance. And a very interesting woman. And she used the Rider-Waite-Smith as her deck of choice in illustrating her books, which is actually the thing that made it the dominant tarot deck. She was the first author to write about tarot in a way that was accessible to all people. Hello, Phoenix in the chat room. Good to see you, Phoenix. And this was revolutionary also. Prior to Eden Gray, most books on tarot had been written in a self-consciously intellectual style that tended to be off-putting to people who were just wanting to learn and not necessarily go into the deepest depths. Eden Gray wrote for everyone, which I've always thought very inspirational of her. And she chose, and she told this story at the World Tarot Congress, the reason she chose the Rider-Waite Smith Tarot was that US Games was at that time selling it in the United States, which made it accessible for people to buy. And so she based her choice of it for her very accessible books on the fact that it was the deck most easy to come by. And these two things, US Games selling it and Eden Gray writing about it, each fed the other in making that deck so ubiquitous. Eden Gray also, interestingly, did not like the expansion of tarot decks that followed 20 years after she had written her books. She really believed in what she thought of as the traditional decks, which were only a few in number. I don't agree with that, but that was her point of view. So Phoenix says in the chat room, self-consciously intellectual equals masturbatory, in my opinion, and I agree. A lot of metaphysical writings have had that masturbatory quality to them, particularly those who chose to be impenetrable. And hello to Jesse in the chat room. And Jesse says, this is great context for the evolution of tarot. Thank you. It's a fascinating story. And particularly the evolution of tarot in the United States is its own history, which is what we've been talking about. If you look at tarot in Europe, its history during the 20th century is quite different. In the United States, almost no one owns tarot cards to play cards with. They own them for divination or nothing. And this is because they don't really have a history in the United States as playing cards. And Mary says, I love Phoenix. He certainly does have a way of putting things succinctly. And I love Phoenix also. But in Europe, tarot has a very strong legacy of being used for playing card games, to the point that some Europeans are offended by the idea of its being used for divination, although that's silly because it's always been used for divination too. But the context for tarot cards in Europe is very different than the context for tarot cards in the US for this reason. I can remember playing Tarot with my late mother as a child, but I don't know many other people who have ever played tarot as playing cards. But that is a thing. And for many Europeans, that's their main use. And you will see in Europe a wide range of tarot decks created simply for artistic variation for people who collect them for that reason as playing cards. If you've ever wondered why certain subjects have been used to create a tarot deck, why is there a tarot of the gnomes? Why is there a baseball tarot? Why is there any number of tarot decks whose metaphysical significance may not seem obvious? It's because that may not be why they were created, because that's not the only way they're used, particularly in other parts of the world. In Europe, I believe Lo Scarabeo is the largest purveyor of tarot cards. I could be mistaken. But a large part of their clientele are not buying them for divination. They're buying them for the artwork and to use as playing cards. And I think most people in the US have no awareness of this at all. And I think I would actually say in the English-speaking world, because I think that throughout the English-speaking world, the idea of tarot for divination and the absence of tarot for playing cards is probably pretty universal. But in the non-English-speaking world, it can be different. And there are also, of course, a number of non-tarot cards, such as the Lenormand cards, the so-called Gypsy witch cards. These are two prominent oracle decks that are quite old. Madame Lenormand, or actually Mademoiselle Lenormand, was At least according to her account, the card reader to Napoleon Bonaparte, her deck is that old. She introduced it during that era. So not a modern oracle deck at all. I believe the Gypsy Witch cards are at least 100 years old to go by the illustrations. And of course, I realize that this is no longer a good name for them, but I have nothing to do with giving them the name. I'm merely speaking that they exist. Hopefully there will be a different name for them in the future, but as a divination deck, they're perfectly fine as far as I recall. I remember getting my first deck of these so-called Gypsy Witch cards at the hospital gift shop in Danville, Illinois, when I, in my early teens, going in for some sort of procedure, and being quite excited to see them because they have the little witch on the cover of the box. And it's interesting, more interesting because it was a Catholic hospital selling Gypsy Witch cards. But it was an interesting time. Now, Calvin says, could you speak on oracle cards a little? I've received a set from Lady Tamara van Forslen, but have not used them as yet. Oracle cards really are any kind of divinatory cards that fall outside of tarot. It's a very broad term. And there are many very famous decks. I've mentioned two of them, the Mademoiselle Lenormand cards, the Gypsy Witch cards. Osho did a famous deck of oracle cards. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different decks of oracle cards. If it uses a system other than tarot, it would normally be considered oracle cards. For example, if you have a set of rune cards, they would be considered oracle cards. If you have a set of Yi Jing cards, they would ordinarily be considered oracle cards. Now, in the Infinite Tarot, we have a number of expansion decks that do use these other systems that would normally be considered outside of tarot. But the whole idea of Infinite Tarot is that tarot is infinitely customizable. So within that context, we look at it differently, but normally you would describe it this way. And Bradley says, I'm about to pull out the Phoenix cards this weekend and read through the book. And the Phoenix cards are a famous set of oracle cards, but considering our earlier conversation about Lord Phoenix and his way with words, you be prepared for an interesting ride with Phoenix cards. Jason pointed out that for many years, in the early years of cards, if you were caught using cards for divination, it could lead to a more serious consequence than if you were caught using them only for gambling. So people did make a point to use what would be divination cards also for gambling so that they could say, we were just playing a gambling game. And in fact, the very first law against cards was because of gambling. And there's the old legend that in early decks, the minor arcana would be published as a set that a person could use for playing cards, and the major arcana would be created separately for people who were going to read cards, so that the person receiving the reading would not have to have those cards, and therefore could not be accused of practicing divination. Is this true? I was certainly taught it, but I don't know that there's anything historically to support it, but it's certainly worth maintaining as part of our history as something that has been said and taught. And Phoenix says, these socio-political lessons about history stay relevant. They certainly do, especially in times like the ones we're living in, where so many things are behaving regressively. We need to remember what our ancestors did in moments of regressive society. because you never know what we may need to adapt. But with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I want to thank you for being here and for spending this time with me. I love you all. I love having these conversations. I hope that you're enjoying them. But seeing so many people in the chat room, I think you must be enjoying them. And that makes me very happy. Again, I love you all. And let us close as we always do with our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to always keep a clear language for you to speak to us, and to always be open to those things that you would say to us, so that we may be guided as we go through life by the wisdom of the divine. And beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for everything that you do in our lives, and we know you are always here with us. But from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. I love you all. I hope to see you again on Monday, and may you be blessed now and always.